We do have the recording started. There we go. So I want to thank you all for joining, not just this morning, but the whole series. These were some of the things that you all gave us input on when the study group started, what kinds of things you were looking forward to, what you wanted to learn. And I hope you've enjoyed the study group as much as I have. I've learned a lot from seeing all of your observations, learning about the plants that you've uploaded to our project there on iNaturalist. We have lots and lots of observers out there and a lot of cool plants and snakes and bees and birds and other things that folks have seen. And I've really enjoyed getting a feel for how that phenological wave has worked across the state. And I won't steal Susan Moore's thunder. She's going to share a little bit about her observations, but it's just so cool to see how many of you are out in different places across the state taking observations and really learning about the natural world. So that's really cool. This morning, we're going to do our Erie to Ohio update. So Jane O'Brien is going to start us off talking about what she sees in Stowe and Hiram in the last week or so, and then Susan Moore, kind of central Ohio and beyond. And then Dave Lonis is going to join us. He's the senior applications developer at OSU, who's the brains behind the Growing Degree Day calendar. And I asked him to come and just give us a kind of brief update of what he does to maintain the calendar, working with the weather stations, and kind of informing all the numbers that go behind what we see when we put in our zip code to the calendar. And then Dan Herms is going to join us and really round off our series talking about phenology and climate change and how all of our observations really matter in the larger scope and how we can, help inform in the greater world of science. So that'll take us through this morning. Let's see. So Jane, I think we have you up first. Are you ready to give us a little update of what you're seeing in Summit County, Lake County, or Portage County in Stowe and Hiram?
Ready? Can you hear me?
A little bit louder. I can hear you.
Okay, let me turn my. Better?
Sure. Go ahead.
I live in Stowe in.
Jane, it's still a little light. Can you get maybe
Really?
right in front of your mic or?
Yeah, I'm right in front. I've got my
80. You'll have to yell maybe today.
Okay. All right, I'm up to 100. Any better?
A little bit. We'll do it. We'll work with it.
Oh, that's it. Okay. Live in Stowe in Summit County. Then I work at Hiram College at their field station in Garrettsville. So I wanted to give you a look at both areas. Go to the next one, Denise. So this is from my yard at home, and these pictures were taken on May 1st. And at that time, the GDD was 279. Last year on May 1st, the GDD was 145, so quite a bit more growing degree days this year. Here's just a few things. You can see the red bud, the eastern red bud. Then in the middle, there are the raspberry bee balm, the Monarda didyma, and the common blue violets. And then there is a jack-in-the-pulpit. Now, the night before, it had frosted very heavily. During the day that I believe that was Sunday, it was sunny, maybe Saturday. But the frost did some damage to my jack-in-the-pulpits, which already up. You can see how it's kind of curled. But I think it got. Okay. Next slide. Okay. The top two pictures show my aronia, chokeberry, and one of my blueberry bushes. And the coloring is due, and the kind of crinkliness of the leaves is due to the frost. So I think the blueberry will be okay. The aronia, the other ones I have in my yard are much fuller, so I'm concerned that I might not have as much on this one. And then across the bottom, the spring beauties, the oh my goodness, gold flame, spirea. There's some penstemon mixed in with some clustered mountain mint, and then my peonies. And they are ahead of last year, definitely. Last year at this time, I had no mountain mint and penstemon up, and the peonies were only about 6 inches. Okay, so here we are in Hiram at the James H. Barrow Biological Field Station in Portage County. And this is the OSU Phenology Garden where I took the pictures. Now, this garden was originally in Ravenna, and it was managed by the master gardeners, but it was on property which it could no longer be maintained. And so my fellow staff members and I moved as many of the plants from that Phenology Garden to the field station. And so these are some of the plants. On the day that I took pictures, because every day this week it has been rainy and it was 63 degrees, the GDD was at 298, where last year at the same time it was at 147. So we've got a picture of a northern bayberry budding out. In the middle, we've got Culver's root and red osier dogwood. And then on the right, we have some rattlesnake master. And it's interesting to me because I have a lot of rattlesnake master at home, and it does not look that full. It's probably only 3 or 4 inches high, and that was at least a foot. Okay, next slide. Next slide.
I'm just slow, Jane. It takes a while to catch up.
Okay, I can't tell if you can hear me. I keep getting messages to talk louder, and I'm talking so loud, and my volume is up at 100. Okay, so once again, this is more of the Phenology Garden. On the top left, there is an elderberry. Next to that, I took a picture of Penstemon digitalis. And one of the things I wanted to show with this picture are all the strawberry plants. The strawberry plants were accidentally brought over when we moved to the Phenology Garden. And for a long time, I tried to fight them. And then I saw a really interesting Zoom class by Wild Ones and taught about green mulch and how strawberries are a great green mulch plant. So this year I am letting all my strawberries grow. And so they're everywhere over the garden, but they're so nice because they stay so low and the plants are just popping up right through them. And then to the right of that is common lilac. On the bottom, we have clustered mountain mint. In the middle, a lot of violets. And to the right is the golden Alexander. I'm excited. I'm involved with the Ohio Bee Survey, and so I'm excited that the golden Alexander is in bloom because that's one of our target plants so that I can start observing bees on it. So, any questions?
Thanks, Jane. So that golden zizia or golden Alexanders does have a little Andrena mining bee that's a specialist. That's what Jane was mentioning. It's a bee that will only go to that plant to collect pollen. So hopefully that bee will show up there. There's some other Andrena mining bees that will visit zizia, but we're especially hunting for that specialist. So thanks for that overview, Jane, from up in the north. And then Susan Moore is going to give us an overview from Central Ohio and South. Susan, do you want to share your screen, or do you want me to pop up by naturalist?
If I could share my screen, this will be my first sharing screen experience. I probably should have contacted you earlier, Denise.
You should be able to. You should have permission.
Okay, so here goes nothing, folks. So thank you in advance for your patience. Okay, so I'm assuming everybody can see that okay? So
yes, that's great.
And you can hear me all right. Excellent. So here in Columbus, and probably in any city, you see maybe a little bit different phenological patterns and rhythms to life. And one of the first things in the spring I notice is the desire to get out and collect things that have gathered along the street. So in my neighborhood, this is one of the first spring things that we do. And the second time that we were out collecting litter, we were at 347-degree days at the beginning of May. So, but back in my yard, just a few blocks away, the Philadelphia fleabane was starting to open up, and my pawpaws were just about at just beyond peak, and the leaves were starting to come out. So, and then the 2nd of May, I found myself a little bit farther south in Fairfield County, helping install some plants that we benefited from with Denise's programming. So this is at Smeck Park. It's part of the Fairfield County Park District. And so this is near Baltimore, Ohio, if anybody's familiar with that area. And just beyond the barn there, you see a line of trees, and there's a really nice hiking trail back in there with woodland plants. So one of the things that I noticed is that the drooping trillium was pretty much past peak, starting to fade, just as the Mayapples were, singing their song in full chorus. So they were pretty much at peak that day. Then on the 3rd, I wandered down to an area in Columbus, Glen Echo Park. Again, if folks are familiar with this part of Columbus, there are a lot of ravines around the Clintonville and University District. It's a really great place to explore. This is a pretty urban area. You're going to see graffiti and the occasional homeless person playing the guitar. So it's a very eclectic area. One of the things I noticed right away, do you see all those warblers in the trees? Me either. So the trees are extremely leafed out right now here in central Ohio. So it makes birding especially challenging. Some of the trees were starting to bloom. This is a wild cherry, and you'll notice a dogwood in the background. So the dogwoods are persisting. I think with the pause with the cool temp certainly has helped. But we did hear a lot of warblers. I know in our earlier discussion, folks were talking about not seeing any, but they're there. It's just they're very difficult to see as they're flitting around looking for caterpillars and such as they continue their journey north. So on the 4th, I live in what's referred to as the Mideast area of Columbus. And so it's kind of in between Bexley and Whitehall. So it's pretty common for me to take neighborhood walks. And this was just one neighborhood walk on the 4th. And so I was taking pictures of, taking pictures of things that I saw in the alleys along the way. One of my favorite scenes this time of year, and I'm going to note the growing degree days so that I don't miss it in subsequent years. But in Capitol University, there are these horse chestnut trees that line a Mound Street, and they're just gorgeous this time of year. So those were a really beautiful sight to see. And then yesterday, I walked around my yard a little bit. My coral honeysuckle is starting to bloom, and the red buckeye in the backyard, and the fleabane. It took 50 growing degree days to get to where it is now. The first slide I showed you, it was still in bud. The golden alexanders are starting to bloom, and some of the native columbine that I have in my front yard is pretty much at peak there underneath my pawpaw tree. So this picture here, it doesn't really look like much, but I'm reminded of the talk with Dr. Gardner in the Spring Authors Series. I think it was one of the guests had referred to landscaping as a mullet landscape, I believe. Denise, do you remember that? It was all business in the front and party in the back. So this time of year, I always wonder, will this be the year that code enforcement shows up at my door? So this is an area behind my garage that I try to let grow as tall as I can before I cut it, because back where this walnut tree is, into the yard is a wonderful expanse of Virginia bluebells that are done now, but I didn't want to cut back the foliage just yet. So there's yellow avens in here and Philadelphia fleabane as well. So that is all I've got at this point. If there are any questions.
All right, great, Susan, thanks. So I just saw, I think it's a new campaign this year with the Xerces Society where they're doing No Mow May. I don't know if anyone else has seen that. So it makes me think of your space that back there with the different flowering plants and trying to allow some of that habitat a little later into the spring. And actually, you know, we talked with Heather Holm mentioned at the Spring Author Series too about waiting until soil temperatures had risen to about 50 degrees for a few days before cutting some of those stalks back. And so I had actually talked with Dave Lonis, who's our applications developer with OSU in Worcester, about bringing in some of that weather data to help us give kind of a target to when have we had about 5 days of average soil temperature at 50 degrees to give us a sense for when is it good to think about cutting those stalks back. So Dave, I think you're on. Did I unmute the right person and promote you to co-host, David Lonis?
Yep. So
great. So David Lonis, folks, as I said, the brains behind the calendar and also the brains behind the Whiz Bang science show. And maybe you've seen Dr. Dave at one of his shows, probably not too recently with COVID, but a really great advocate for science and getting kids excited about bringing science into their lives. So he said he's out in the field today. I see you're in your car, Dave.
Yeah. So let me start if I can do this properly.
Okay.
Well, maybe not. Start broadcast. There we go. All right. So I'm just going to start off giving you a little bit of background of how we get the data for your growing degree days, because that's kind of the basis of what this is. So it's a update on we call it a Mesonet, the group of weather stations that we have around the state. It's a fancy word I just learned about 10 years ago. So I always called it our weather stations, and now it's the Mesonet. So we have 10 stations that are at our college's locations, so the branches and the main campus around the state. And we also have 4 stations that USDA has set up at cooperators, and these are all along Lake Erie. And so currently, those 4 stations, those has retired and about a year ago, and they haven't replaced her yet. So some of those stations are needing some tender loving care. So I'm trying to work with USDA to get those, some of the sensors replaced on some of those. Needing come back spring. The year following, these all the old stations were replaced with new ones by Campbell Scientific, and so we're starting to see some wear and tear on those stations. We just put in new temperature and humidity probes at 0.5 meter and 3 meters in the past 3 years at the stations, and this is to look for temperature inversions. This was a project with Jim DeGrand. He's the assistant state climatologist, and with the Bird Polar and Climate Research Center. So they paid for those probes and helped us get those installed around the state. And currently we're converting from landlines to cell modems. That's been working on that in the past 2 months. And today I'm actually finished with a trip to the Eastern branch, and hopefully we'll get that will take care of a lot of the problems we've had. A lot of our weather stations are out in the middle of nowhere, for a better way to say it, and the phone lines are really iffy in a lot of these places, and so it's times have weather stations go offline because of a phone issue. So hopefully with converting it to cell modems, we'll be able to have a much more consistent, better ability to get the data. We have changed the data collection to hourly now. With cell modems, it's just like it's on the internet. So it's very easy to download data. And in the past, we've been doing it about every 8 hours. And current staff is Lee Wilson. He does the hardware. And Lee's been here for over 30 years. And if you ever meet Lee, he'll probably have a Hawaiian shirt on. You'll know that's Lee. And me, and there's a picture of me. Denise has me do the Bugs World event. I present a show for that, and there I am on stage with my bicycle and helmet and an egg. We talk about life cycles. So that's a fun thing I get to do. But so Lee does the hardware part of it. I do the data collection and presentation, and it's actually a small part of each of our jobs. And so, I've been here this is my 28th year. And so we're both getting to the end of our careers here. Denise hates to hear that, but that's one of the facts of life. So what does the future hold for us? Where we're starting to train some new blood on the hardware and data management so that we'll have people that'll be able to take over when we're gone. So we're working with the Assistant State Climate and bird puller research staff to improve the system. It's kind of funny. I was back in Illinois at Champaign-Urbana for some meetings on these Mesonets, and I had to go there to meet the Ohio climatologist and make a connection with him. We kind of joked about that. That's how we made our connection, was about 500 miles away from Ohio. And so we've really gotten along good together and are working closely to try to improve the system we have. And one of the big things is improving the quality of the data. So he's downloaded all the old data and has a team of undergrads working on doing analysis and looking for where there's data where a sensor was malfunctioning and we just didn't catch it. So I'm trying to do that because that's very important. We'll see that sometimes. It's just happened this spring where a sensor started reporting that it was, I'm not sure if it was reporting it was 140 degrees or negative 140 degrees, but that really kind of screws up growing degree days when we get a few readings like that in. Thankfully, you guys catch it pretty quickly, and we can correct that. And we're also one of the very positive things that's happening right now is we're looking at expanding our system. We have a new administrator, Ann Durantz, and she uses, in her research, she uses weather data. So she really knows the importance of it. And she's expressed the interest of putting some more resources into this. And hopefully that means getting some more staff whose main focus is improving the quality of data and actually adding more weather stations to the mix. So if you compare us to our neighbor, Kentucky has its own Mesonet department with 12 full-time people. That's all they do is work on weather data, collecting it, managing the weather stations. They have a weather station in every county, and so I think it's around 80 stations they have, and they really have some really great systems, and they put it on cooperators' property, and the cooperators actually pay for part of the system. So it's kind of a sponsorship type of program they have. So hopefully our future, we're just she's just calling a group of us together, and Durance is, for a meetings in the next couple of weeks. So hopefully we'll see some good news come out of that, what we're going to possibility of doing. So just for that, how you can help with that is if our weather station network, the Mesonet, has benefited you, send a note to Denise Ellsworth explaining how. Just having those statements from our stakeholders is really helpful when we're going to administration to try to get them to put resources in an area. So if it's benefited you, let us know. That will really help us out, and continue to use our system. And if there's another way you'd like to see the data presented, please let us know, because I know Denise has been throwing some ideas at me lately. I haven't been able to get to anything yet because I've been pretty busy trying to get everything else done here. But hopefully in the future we'll have a few new things with the system, so that you'll be able to do some better prediction of what's going to happen. So here's a picture of one of our weather stations. That's my boss. I took him out to help me do a update on the modem, and there's a lot of wires in it. It runs with a solar panel and a battery, and I was kind of laughing about it because every one of these stations, if you look down, there's a plug-in with every one of the stations that we don't use for power. And I was like, why don't we use this for power? And nobody really has a good explanation for that. So if we did use power from being able to plug it into 120 volts, we could have a lot more sensors, and sensors could do a lot more things to them. So possibility for the future. So I know that was fast. You got any questions or comments?
Great, thanks, Dave. Do you have the website? People are wondering where they can tap in directly to Mesonet information.
Yes. If you go, let me. Yeah, not there.
And while he's pulling that up, folks, if you have comments or accolades for Dave or the weather station or needs, go ahead and put that in the chat, and I'll just capture the chat too and forward that on to folks. I really want to thank Dave. On a shoestring, Dave and I try to pull together what we can. Often people will contact me if they're, say, somebody from the Ohio Department of Agriculture or somebody from a nursery notices that the Growing Degree website seems off a little bit. I'll get with Dave, and he's right on it to try to get things corrected. And some of you have noticed when you've gone back into past data that the numbers seem different. So Dave, when you talked about that as, sensors were down, that's why sometimes that old data comes back a little differently, because it's been corrected.
Yeah. So here's the current site. And if you just search for CFAS, CFAS weather system, you'll come up to this. It's on our oardc.ohio-state.edu/weather. So, and it has lots of different graphs. If you notice, when you bring up a site and bring up data, you'll see there's graphs on the left side that present data in a different way. And I used to have some students that work for me, and they enjoyed trying to make the graphs we were challenged with doing. And so I don't have any students with me currently. So, but it's kind of a fun part. And this is actually the most satisfying part of my job, because I think it has the most effect. It's used by a lot of growers out there, and I know a lot of you work with it with phenology. So it's really what I've really enjoyed doing it, and we've probably been doing it since 2000. I bet 99, 2000. We've been doing the Growing Degree days. So it's been quite a project.
So Dave, in those spaces in the state where there is no station or no data coming from, how do you extrapolate then to work on those GDDs to calculate those?
And so I worked with the College of Worcester students to come up with a formula where we know the latitude and longitude of every zip code in the state. So when you put in your zip code, it calculates how far you are from the weather stations. And we looked at the weather stations and looked kind of how the direction of the gradient of temperatures is across the state. And so we came up with a formula where it takes information and it weighs it about on how far you are from each station and calculates your growing degree days based on that. So if you're real close to a station, you'll be based mostly on that station. Now, if you're out in the middle where there isn't any, it'll go to those stations that are near you, but not too near you, and it'll just make it extrapolate from that data what yours is. So it's not a perfect method, but it's the best we got. And so that's what kind of excites me. If the university wants to invest some more money and get more weather stations out there, we will really get much better data for our users on growing degree days. And it really wouldn't take a lot. I think if you strategically put some stations around, because like in the eastern part and the western part, we're both got some big blank spots there. And also, I've been trying to work with Kentucky to use some of their data so that we can, just along the southern border, we'd have a little better coverage down there. So they say that they're willing, but we just haven't been able to get them to give me the information. So not sure what I need to do. I think I just need to bug them some more here. So any other questions, comments?
Great. Thanks again, Dave. You're welcome to stick around and stay with us, but I know you have other places that you're going today, but really appreciate your update. And Dan, we're going to turn the floor over to you. So a perfect segue. And of course, Dan Herms, the Vice President for Research at Davey Tree, formerly professor at OSU in the Department of Entomology, and the developer, as all of you know, of the Growing Degree Day calendar. And Dan, we've talked a lot about the calendar and its development, ways to use the Growing Degree Day calendar, and would also just love to hear a little bit from you how you got enthused about phenology, how this became a passion for you, and then how we can all help to keep this all going and use the science of phenology in what we do. So thanks so much, Dan, for being with us.
Welcome, Denise. Thanks for the invitation to be here this morning. And David, if you're still with us, I just want to thank you for the 2 decades of collaboration and making the Growing Degree website, Growing Degree Day website, a reality and keeping it going. It's the envy of the nation. There's really no other state that has a real-time degree day statewide coverage network like we do. One thing that Dave really didn't get into is kind of like the historical contingencies about why the stations are located where they are and why there's not, wider coverage, why it seems somewhat arbitrary around the state of Ohio. And so the OARDC weather stations are located at the OARDC branch research stations. And those were located in different soil types of agricultural regions of Ohio. And initially, they weren't designed to generate a statewide network of weather, but rather to provide data for the experiments that were going on at that particular research station. And so Dave was able to pull those weather stations together, those existing weather stations together into the Mesonet. And USDA added a few at major nursery areas because that's the focus of that USDA Agricultural Research Service lab that's based in Worcester. And so that's kind of the historical accident really, I guess, of why the stations are located where they are. They're located on OARDC property around the state. So I'm going to share my screen and ask Denise if she's seeing my slides.
Yep, looks good.
Okay, great. So, yeah, phenology has been a passion of mine for really my whole professional career, beginning as an undergraduate. And I will kind of talk a little bit about how I got into that. But I want to talk about phenology maybe from a perspective that you haven't considered, or probably you have. But that is that phenology is the foundation of ecology, and thus the really the existence of biological life on Earth. As you know, it's the study of recurring biological events. This article, which I think is available as a PDF on the internet, really talks about the central role that phenology plays in the science of ecology, community ecology, ecosystem ecology, evolution, the biosphere. You can see phenology is right at the center, affected by weather, flowering, pollination that you've been talking about, community structure, nutrient cycling, herbivory, which is the dominant interaction on the planet, things eating plants, carbon uptake, and so forth. So phenology is so fundamental to life and science. And, you know, some examples of major phenological events are these massive pulses in the availability of resources that drive, you know, major events like the congregation of grizzly bears in Alaska to fatten on the salmon in the fall, the massive mammal migration in the Serengeti, driven by the growth of vegetation in response to seasonal precipitation cycles. This is the world's largest fish, a whale shark, and they congregate in the spring in Belize on the reef when the snapper are spawning and filling the ocean with the eggs that these filter feeders eat. The phenology of Earth's carbon cycle. So what we're seeing right now, the leafing out of the trees. So this is a massive creation of the world's most abundant protein, ribisco, the photosynthetic enzyme. And it will all be destroyed in the fall. The world's most abundant protein created and destroyed every year. And this drives phenological changes that are very detectable in the Earth's atmosphere. And so here you can see this steady increase in carbon dioxide that's driven by anthropogenic emissions. Now we're actually up over 415 parts per million. But you see overlaid on this steady increase is this sawtooth pattern. And here you can see the sawtooth pattern, the seasonal pattern. And so it reaches a peak just before the trees leaf out in the spring in the northern hemisphere, where the Earth's deciduous forests are concentrated. And then photosynthesis starts, as it is now. And that photosynthesis draws down the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere until the fall, when photosynthesis ceases in the deciduous trees, and then the CO2 concentration begins to increase again. The phenology of nutrient cycling. So as that photosynthetic enzymes are destroyed, the leaves senesce, they drop to the floor, and you have the phenology of nutrient cycling, which is really, you know, fundamental to primary productivity and food web support in natural ecosystems. So I'm going to talk about now just a little bit about phenological synchrony. And this relates to interactions between different organisms and how that's driven by phenology. And plant-insect interactions was a focus of my research and my students. This insect is a wasp, a gall-making wasp. This is on an oak tree, an expanding bud, an expanding shoot on oak. And this wasp has to lay its egg at just the right phenological stage development of this shoot for the gall to form, which will subsequently then produce the shelter and food for her offspring. And so if the timing is off, if the synchrony is off, that gall won't form successfully, and she won't be able to successfully reproduce. And so I'm going to talk a little bit later about how climate change might be impacting phenological synchrony, but I want to talk about the importance of phenological synchrony in plant-insect interactions. And so this phenological window hypothesis was proposed in the late 70s by a scientist at Cornell, Paul Feeney, and then elaborated upon in the early 80s by Bill Matson, who actually happened to be my PhD advisor a little bit later on. But it recognizes that there's a window of time when plant traits are most suitable for the insect that feeds on that plant. And if the insect development falls outside of this phenological window, the growth and survival of this insect will be modified. And I want to talk about a study that one of my PhD students did looking at this phenological window for European pine sawfly. So European pine sawfly is feeding right now. In fact, they look, I was collecting some just yesterday, and they look, they're in this stage right here. They've been feeding on these needles, stripping the chlorophyll, the outer epidermis, causing this kind of wispy, burnt look. As they get larger, they'll consume the entire needles. They feed only on the old needles. They will not feed on the expanding needles. These expanding needles have concentrations of resin acids, terpenes that are toxic. They're too high for the larvae to manage in their diet. But those concentrations decline over the course of the season, and then by next year, the needles become suitable to feed on. Here are the eggs. The eggs are laid in the needles individually in these rows. And so their common host plants are Mugo pine and Scots pine. Now, here's Rodrigo, my PhD student that studied this, Rodrigo Chorbajian. He's now a professor at the Catholic University in Santiago, Chile, his home country. And he was interested in physiological constraints on the life history of this sawfly. And so the interesting thing is that even though these insects feed on old needles, and the old needles are present 365 days a year, the insect only has one generation early in the spring. Other sawflies have two generations that feed on pine. And there's plenty of degree days for this insect to have two generations. But only one. And the question is why? Why only one? The evolutionary fitness would be much higher if they completed a second generation. And so again, they hatch late April, about the time calorie pairs are blooming. And then they finish their life cycle by early June. And so they're feeding on the old needles during this time of shoot expansion. Then they diapause throughout the summer, when they could be having a second generation. The adults emerge in late summer and early fall and mate and lay eggs in the old needles. So why? Why do they feed on just this short period of time? So he conducted some experiments to manipulate the phenology, the phenological window of Scots pine. Scots pine is the evolutionary host. So Scots pine is native to Europe, Northern Europe, and Northern Asia. It's one of the most widely distributed trees on Earth. It's not native to North America, but it's been widely planted and it's naturalized as it's escaped from Christmas tree plantations, etc. And European pine sawfly is also native to the Northern Europe and Asia and has co-evolved with Scots pine. But the insect is well established Doesn't really feed much on native North American pines, but it's well established in North America on these European pines. So he conducted these experiments where he had natural phenology, so the eggs hatching in their normal time. And then he advanced egg hatch so that they were feeding earlier than they normally would. And this was done in a greenhouse. And they also delayed bioassays, so keep eggs in the refrigerator and have them feeding later in the season than they normally would, and looked at their response. And basically what they found is that this is the survival of larvae feeding on 1-year-old needles, 2-year-old needles, 3-year-old needles. And in the spring, during this period of April, May, their survival was the highest. Then it dropped rapidly. So by late spring, the insects could not survive on these needles. Then as the needles started to get older again into the following spring, the insect was able to survive on them again. So they can't survive on the expanding needles, and they can't survive on the old needles during the summer, which was kind of surprising. And this looks at the growth rate and the phenological stage of the needle. So this is, as this is a kind of an index that measures how advanced the phenology of the shoot expansion is. And as you get into the spring, again, you see that the larval growth just declines to zero as you get into mid to late spring. So as these shoots expand, the quality of these needles decline to the point where they become completely unsuitable. And so he looked at the chemistry of these needles, and he looked in particular at the protein and the amino acid concentrations, and also the terpenoid concentrations, which are toxins. The amino acids and protein, of course, are nutrients. And what he found is that as these buds start expanding and these shoots expanding, this growth is supported by nitrogen, amino acids, and proteins that are broken down, and amino acids that are exported from the old needles into support the growth of the new needles. And the old needles become so depauperate in nutrients that the larvae can't survive. So this phenological window of survival for the insect is driven by the phenology of source-sink interactions and the translocation of nitrogen from old needles to new needles. And then as these expand and the needles go on, the nitrogen uptake from the soil causes the nitrogen concentration to increase again to the point where these older needles become suitable once again. So that was kind of an interesting. Also, he found that the concentration of toxins increased as the concentration of nitrogens decreased in these old needles. So phenological changes in chemistry constraining the evolution of the life cycle of this insect. Another student of mine studied the birch leaf miner. You might be familiar with this. This is another sawfly, a leaf mining sawfly. Here are adults. They overwinter in the soil as pupae. The adults emerge at bud break as the leaves are expanding. They mate, they lay their eggs. The larvae feed in the developing leaf. Here, if you hold it up to the light, you can see the larvae inside the leaves. You can have multiple larvae, up to 20 larvae per leaf. Here you can see multiple mines in this leaf, and they can get to the point where they can compete. There's not enough food. Once you get more than 8 or 9 larvae, there's not enough food, and they actually become pretty vicious. They push at each other, they bite each other, competing for what is a limited resource. Now, birch has a phenology of its indeterminate growth, which means that they produce new leaves throughout the growing season. And so, they have a big flush of leaves now, and then they continue to produce leaves on these expanding shoots throughout the growing season. So that's a little bit of background here. What we found studying the phenology of birch leaf miner, which I found surprising hadn't been reported before, was that the first generation is much bigger than the second and third generation. There's 3 generations per year. This insect has 3 generations per year. Voltinism refers to the number of generations. And the first generation is much larger. The second generation, about a third of that. And then the third generation, very small. And this pattern is consistent year over year. And then the question is why? So again, if the insect can complete more generations, the evolutionary fitness would be much higher and those genes would spread through the population. But the vast majority of the population is only completing 1 generation. And so we wondered if this was not like a bet hedging strategy, whether there are risks of trying to complete a second or third generation and whether there are benefits to just completing 1 generation that would outweigh the benefits of the increased reproductive potential of the second, third generation. And what we found, this was Joe Chichester, who is a graduate student in my lab, he found that as the leaves get tougher, they become unsuitable. And so leaves, as they expand, they're young and they're tender. That's where they lay their eggs. As those leaves get fully expanded, and you've all seen this, they get darker, they get greener, they get tougher. And this is, these numbers are the number of grams of force that's required to puncture a leaf. And he measured that in relation to the survival of the larvae. And so these are, the black bar is our newly hatched larvae. And once the leaf got tough enough where it took more than 250 grams of force, 100% of the larvae died. So essentially, soon after a leaf became fully mature, newly hatched larvae could not survive. You had a little bit higher survival of younger larvae, and mature larvae can make it through a mature leaf if they get started while the leaf is immature. But if they start, if the egg is laid in an immature leaf or a mature leaf, they can't survive. And furthermore, he found that the pupal mass is related in a negative way to the density. So this is indication of competition. So the more larvae per leaf, the less that the pupae weigh. And so here it's cut in half. And so pupal weight is related to 2 things. One, it's related to reserves to survive diapause. And 2, it's related to how many eggs that a female will weigh. And so these larvae in high populations and heavy leaves had more of a propensity to emerge and try to complete a second generation. And he hypothesized that this is because they wouldn't have the reserves to last all the way through the winter. So they'll give it a shot. Now, the problem is that in the spring, every leaf is immature. It's suitable. But by June, only a small percentage of the leaves are immature. And in late summer, even a smaller percentage of leaves are immature. If everybody came out and emerged for a second generation, there would not be enough leaves. So they're taking their chance. The ones that emerge are taking their chance that their relatives will stay in the soil. And if you look at the percentage of adults that emerge to complete a second and then a third generation, the solid line, and the percentage of leaves that are immature, with 100% in the spring being a reference point, you can see that the number of insects emerging to complete a second generation and a third generation are precisely tracking the availability of immature leaves. So the phenological window and the strategy of a bet hedging diapause strategy. So another way that growing degree days can affect insect phenology and life cycles relates to how long it takes to develop And a colleague of mine, Matt Ayers, who was a graduate student when we completed our PhDs together. We're good friends, and he's a professor of biology and ecology at Dartmouth College now. But he studied the phenology and life history of the tiger swallowtail butterfly, such a fascinating insect. The tiger swallowtail butterfly, there's actually two species. It was thought at one time to be one species that extended from Florida to Alaska. Now it's known to be two species, a southern species and a northern species. We have the southern species in Ohio. They hybridize in central Michigan, where the forest transitions to the boreal forest. He studied the northern species, Papilio canadensis, on a transect from northern Michigan to Alaska, and found that they have really different life cycles. So comparing Alaska to Michigan populations, the Alaska population has an elevated metabolic rate. They grow faster at lower temperatures. So for example, a temperature of about 55 degrees, an Alaska swallowtail can double their weight in 6 days, where it takes 9 days for the Michigan swallowtail. They molt faster at lower temperatures, so they have a higher metabolic rate. And they have other life history trade-offs. So the Alaska swallowtail lays larger eggs, but fewer of them, and they have smaller adult body size. So what does this mean? It means the caterpillars grow faster, but they don't get as big. They start bigger from bigger eggs, but they pupate at a smaller weight and they grow faster. So these are all adaptations to completing a life cycle in an area where you have constraints on the number of degree days. You have to squeeze your life cycle in the amount of degree days that you have available. In Michigan, there's many more degree days, and they can grow longer, get bigger, lay more eggs, but there's always, the fitness trade-off between number of eggs and size of eggs is pretty universal. An interesting thing that they found is that in Alaska, the host plants, so this would be willow, aspen, things like that they lay their eggs on, the preference that the female has is very highly correlated with how fast the larvae can grow on that tree. So they lay their eggs. There's a strong relationship between their oviposition preference and the growth rate of the larvae. Again, an adaptation to grow as fast as they can. In Michigan, there was no such relationship. In Michigan, there's plenty of degree days, so the selection isn't to grow as fast. They were looking at other reasons why they would choose to lay their eggs on one species over another. And one hypothesis was that maybe they experience higher predation rate on a different host plant. But anyway, degree days constrain phenology in the tiger swallowtail butterfly. So when you see a butterfly ovipositing, think about that. Now, this is a giant swallowtail butterfly larva. This is on property that my wife and I own in central Michigan, where we used to live when I worked at the Dow Gardens in the 1980s to mid 90s before I came to Ohio State. And at that time, giant swallowtail caterpillars were not found that far north. They barely made it into southern Michigan. They feed on plants in the citrus family, the Rutaceae. And in central Michigan, the only host is prickly ash. And typically they had one generation a year, but this caterpillar is feeding on October 9th. And the question is, can it complete the phenological race with the weather? Can it complete its development before it gets killed by frost? And if it is killed by frost, that would eliminate the genes for a second generation. If it survives, then those genes for a second generation would proliferate in the population. So they're kind of playing it on the cusp right now as to whether that second generation will become common in central Michigan or whether it will be eliminated or rare. But in the last several years, we have found these late second generation caterpillars. I don't know what became of that. We're not up there enough to follow them through to the end, but they overwinter as pupae. And so it'll be interesting to see, what happens with that population. But that's evidence that the climate's warming, the northward migration, the expansion from one generation to two generations. And this has been a steady pattern, especially since about 1970. The Earth's climate has been warming very steadily. The last 5 years have been the warmest 5 years in the instrument record, going back to 1880. 20 of the 21 warmest years since 1880 have occurred since the year 2000. So you have this kind of steady, unabated warming that's been mechanistically linked to a very similar increase in carbon dioxide concentration that's now up to 415 parts per million from 280 parts per million at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and 340 parts per million when I was a graduate student. So this warming climate is, of course, changing phenology, and phenological records have been used as evidence to document the change in climate. So, for example, Henry David Thoreau collected detailed phenological measurements that have been revisited to show that spring is coming earlier at Walden Pond. I thought I had that slide was out of order. OERDC is part of a long-term national phenology network going back to the 1960s. These red Rothmajensis lilacs growing next to the weather station out in front of the Stonehouse. There's Crablandia behind it. So these were planted in the 1960s, and they were planted at every one of these locations across North America and were monitored since then and have documented earlier springs. And of course, I think the champion phenological record is the cherry blossom bloom in Japan, going back more than 1,000 years, 1,200 years. No real pattern in when they would bloom in the spring until very recently, blooming earlier and earlier. And I just saw in the news this year, they bloomed earlier than they ever have over this 1,200 year period. Now, not only is spring coming earlier, but winters are getting warmer. The USDA plant hardiness zone maps updated since 1990. Ohio was, when I was a student in horticulture in the late 70s, early 80s, Ohio was zone 5, except the very southern tip of the state here where I grew up in Portsmouth, Ohio, was zone 6. We would see plants down there, southern magnolias, mimosas, things that you didn't see back then elsewhere in Ohio. But now Ohio is all of Ohio is zone 6, except for a little cold pocket in Mansfield that's still zone 5. And of course, the winters are predicted to continue to warm. And so Davy Tree Expert Company, where I work with now, is partnered with Arbor Day Foundation to develop a website that will project how hardiness zones will change in the future based on emission scenarios, which is the biggest question mark in future climate. Will emissions be limited, or will we continue as we are? And so there's a best case scenario, which is equivalent to the Paris Climate Accord, and a worst case scenario, which is continuing as we are now. In either event, Columbus, Ohio is predicted to become zone 7 within 50 years. So precipitation is increasing. Heavy precipitation events are becoming more frequent, leading to more severe flooding, storms, intensities increasing. So Dr. Gary Johnson, our arboriculture professor at University of Minnesota, compiled these data showing that the frequency of tree damaging thunderstorms in Minnesota has increased tenfold since the 1960s. And so the the US has warmed about 2 degrees Fahrenheit since the beginning of the 20th century, which is about the same as the Earth as a whole. Some areas have warmed more than others. For example, the New England, the high Central Plains, the Southwest. 2 degrees might not sound like a lot, but consider that the difference in temperature between the coldest part of the last glacial period and the warmest part of the interglacial is 9 degrees Fahrenheit. So 2 degrees Fahrenheit is significant. That's a lot of heating. We're already committed really to another 2 degrees Fahrenheit because of the heat trapped in the ocean and the thermal inertia that has created. So we're pretty much looking at 3 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit, which is what the Paris Climate Accord would try to limit us to. So, how much is the Earth going to warm, or in the U.S. in particular? And so, as I mentioned before, the biggest uncertainty is our greenhouse gas emissions. And so the EPA and climate change models use different emission scenarios. Best case scenario, we're looking at, as I mentioned, that 4 degrees to maybe 6.5 degrees Fahrenheit. That's very substantial. Worst case, 11 degrees Fahrenheit, that's going to be devastating. How accurate are these models? So these projections are based on models. And this shows the results of a model that was published in 1990. 30 years ago, this model was published. The dark line is the consensus model, the means. These faint lines are the low and high extreme models. And these jagged colored lines are the observed temperature that has occurred since then. So this model was published in the first report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 30 years ago. That's when this black line was published. And then you can see what the climate has done since then. Right now, we're clustered points up in this area. So the model, this 30-year-old model was quite accurate in predicting the warming that has occurred in the last 30 years. And the models have gotten only far better. Supercomputing power has increased dramatically. Our understanding of the climate system has increased dramatically. The models now include things like cloud cover, better assessment of feedbacks, much finer spatial resolution. And so, these predictions that have continued warming, I think we can really put a lot of confidence in. So what, making this kind of tangible, what will this feel like? So, by the end of the century, under a low to moderate scenario, Ohio is going to be like Arkansas in the summer and North Carolina in the winter. So very different climate, very different suitability for tree habitat, very different phenology. And tree distributions are already changing. So for example, the spruce fir forest in green is migrating out of New England, but other trees are benefiting. So the oak hickory forest, the tan, forest productivity is increasing overall in this part of the country because precipitation is increasing, the climate's getting warmer, and so there's winners and losers. In Ohio, a loser is going to be sugar maple. Sugar maple is going to migrate to the north. So the the present range in the yellow, the future range in the blue. So sugar maple is going to be moving out of Ohio. What causes the distributions of these trees to change? They don't get up and walk to the north. So for their distribution to move north, they have to die off in the south and start growing in the north. And we understand well what causes them to grow in the north. It gets warmer, seeds can survive. They're not killed by frost and so forth. In the South, it can be more complicated, and it can result from another of things. For example, insects like bronze birch borer kill drought-stressed trees. That can eliminate mature trees, and it is eliminating mature trees at the southern limit of the distribution of birch. Seedling survival can also be impacted by summer drought, and so can the phenology of pollination. So reproduction, survival, all these things can be impacted. In New England, pines are experiencing more disease from the increased humidity. This reduces their competitive ability. So fortunately, Ohio has a number of tree species. In fact, probably most of our tree species are well within what's termed the climate envelope. Climate envelope determines where a tree grows, and it's based very largely on temperature, mean temperature, extreme temperature, and precipitation. So if you look at Ohio with American beech, red maple, red oak, shagbark hickory, these species are going to be in Ohio for a long time to come and do well. We have other trees that are near their normal limits: black gum, tulip tree, honey locust. These tree species will do well in Ohio for years to come. And then we have southern species that are not native in northern Ohio, but we know from experience that they will grow well when they're planted here: sweet gum, river birch, bald cypress. So these trees also will perform well in Ohio for years to come. But they'll face some other threats. So for example, not only are the trees moving north, but so are pests. So southern pine beetle, which is an outbreak species that kills pine, a bark beetle, has moved into the New Jersey pine lands where it never existed because it was not, couldn't survive the winters, and is killing pines in this endemic habitat. And so returning to some work by my colleague, Matt Ayers, he's looked at the survival of southern pine beetle in relation to temperature during the winter. When the temperature drops down into the yellow, you get about 50% mortality of the overwintering insects, and when down into the orange, close to 100%. What you can see in these New Jersey areas, the winter temperatures just are not getting down there, and so the beetle's been able to make excursions and establish, really, not just excursions. It's made excursions into Ohio as well. And then this paper was recently published showing this integrates what's known about southern pine beetle hardiness and climate models to project the expansion of southern pine beetle by 2050. Well, right now it's spread not only into New Jersey, up into even Maine, along coastal Maine, Massachusetts. You know, we see this Davy tree in our service records, you know, the calls that we get and so forth. By 2050, you know, well up into Ohio, by 2080 up into the boreal forest where it'll be impacting jack pine, so, and red pine. Southern pine beetle won't, the southern won't be an appropriate part of its name anymore. Same thing's happening in the western Rockies. Mountain pine beetle spreading north and to higher altitudes where it never existed, and has caused massive mortality of pine trees. I just read an article that this is in part contributing to the dramatic spike in lumber prices that we're seeing now that have tripled this year. If anybody has been, you know, looking to build a home or addition or whatever, you know, are probably aware of this substantial increase in timber prices, lumber prices. Furthermore, this article published in 2008 has documented that this pine mortality, where mountain pine beetle never existed, has turned these boreal forests from a carbon sink into a carbon source as they die and decompose. So creating a feedback to climate change, the largest bark beetle outbreak ever recorded on Earth. And so this paper published in 2001 looked again at what's known about the hardiness of mountain pine beetle and climate models, and predicted that mountain pine beetle would spread from its historic red range into the blue range, which it has. That's where these outbreaks are occurring. And that by 2010 or so, that it would be able to survive at the highest altitudes of the Rocky Mountains there, breach the Rocky Mountains, move down the east slope into the jack pine forest where lodgepole pine hybridizes, and then have and this is the jack pine forest, where it creates a corridor for it to migrate to the Great Lakes regions, where we know our pines are susceptible to this insect from the history of planting them in the West. This prediction came to pass in about 2010, as it was predicted. Mountain pine beetle has moved down the east slope. It's moved into Alberta, and this grand experiment is underway. And it could be that mountain pine beetle and southern pine beetle will collide in the not too distant future. Let's see what impact that has on our pine forests. So not all species are migrating north, though. For example, a study found that this bumblebee is being very stressed at the southern end of its distribution, but it's not increasing its distribution to the north for some reason. And so this is putting a squeeze on its population. And coming back to the phenological synchrony and the phenological window, phenological asynchrony is caused by when the interacting species respond in different ways to climate. Plant herbivores, plant pollinators, predator, prey, etc. Plant pollinator interactions, so specialized pollinators respond differently than their plants do. Causes this mismatch among mutualisms. What are the consequences of this for the insect and the plant remains largely unknown. Bird phenology and food supply. So these Arctic geese, the plants that they feed on, these grasses and sedges, have started growing earlier. And by the time the geese arrive, they've gotten tough and they're not as suitable as food for their offspring. So this has caused a mismatch between reproductive timing and food supply these early springs. Phenological synchrony between spring green up and the arrival of migratory birds. And so as the plants green up, the caterpillars hatch earlier, the birds get here later. So what are the impacts of that relative to their food supply? And so, do the caterpillars escape predation? Do the birds have less food? So these kind of things are being studied and documented. So how did I get into phenology? Well, it didn't relate to climate change. Climate change was not on my radar when I started studying phenology. My first foray into phenology was a class project assigned by Stephen Still, who was my horticulture professor at Ohio State, spring quarter 1981. He assigned us a project where we had to record the flowering dates of 50 woody plants, trees and shrubs, and report those. And so I kind of got obsessed with keeping track of the dates and so forth, and I still do. Yesterday we saw our first red-headed woodpecker. Last week our first hummingbird. We continue to write this stuff down when our trees are blooming. For my master's research, I studied the phenology of insects on honey locust trees. So here's me when I had more hair on my head and less fat on my belly. And after I got my master's degree at Ohio State, I saw this job ad in the Botanic Garden newsletter at Dow Gardens. And the first responsibility, applied research, IPM phenology. And so having experience with phenology of plants and insects, I thought, yeah, I can do this. Doug Chapman was visionary director of Dow Gardens, who also received his graduate degree at Ohio State in horticulture, who was advised by Dr. Chadwick. And so I worked at Dow Gardens for 13 years. It was a wonderful experience. His kind of vision was that plants could be used as phenological indicators to reduce kind of simplify the logistics of monitoring a large number of pests in diverse landscapes, like an arboretum or a nursery or a diverse landscape. Since plant development is temperature dependent, phenological events can be used as a biological calendar. So you've been exposed to this. I conducted research at the Dow Gardens from 1984 to 1989. In 2017, I took a gap year between my job at Ohio State and my job at Davie to go back to spend 9 months in Michigan, and revisited the phenology at Dow Gardens. Indeed, it was earlier than it was in the early 80s. By the way, February 1985, my first winter in Michigan, was the last month that the average temperature of Earth was below the 20th century average. Every month since February 1985 has been warmer than the 20th century average for that month. Came to Ohio State 1997 and conducted the phenological study there. Again, for comparison purposes, that became the basis of the website that Dave Lonis developed, looking at 70 odd species of plants and 50 some species of arthropods. You're familiar with the phenological calendar. Here's a subset of plants in yellow, insects in white. The degree days using 50 degrees Fahrenheit and January 1st as a starting date. But the biological calendar, its value is that it can be used to make appointments. So when red buds blooming, gypsy moth egg hatch, but you're too early for your appointment for pine needle scale to monitor that. By the time black locust is blooming and bronze birch borer and emerald ash borer are emerging, you're too late for your appointment with pine needle scale. One of the things that we found, and this might be the most important finding, is that the sequence remains constant from year to year. So you can put a high degree of confidence in the biological calendar. So the white points are plants, the yellow points are insects. So this is the average sequence over this 4-year period used to predict the phenology in 2002. And this blue line is 1-to-1 line. Any point that's on that line is perfect correspondence. You can see the divergence from this line is rather insignificant of practical importance for pest management. So the sequence is very accurate from year to year, and relatively accurate from one region to another, comparing Ohio to Michigan. There are a few, this is, I believe, Euonymus scale, willow leaf beetle, so you probably need to confirm this yourself in your region before extrapolating to another region, but generally very, very good. And the fact that it is so consistent from year to year is you don't need to do this for 7 years or 12 years like I did. Just make a solid observation and it will hold going forward. So another important milestone in my phenological history was this date, February 4th, 1999. This was the first time Denise Ellsworth invited this young, untenured assistant professor to speak at one of her programs. I can't remember if it was a Master Gardener program or just a general program, but a workshop on ornamental plant problems. And I talked about phenology. And Denise and I have been great collaborators ever since, more than 20 years now on phenology. And Denise was the driving force behind the Phenological network, the Ohio State Phenology Garden network that I think you're familiar with. I think you've heard from Ashley Kolhanik. Ashley was a graduate student in my lab, and she analyzed all the data from these phenology gardens, documented various patterns like the phenological wave. We know that things start blooming down in the Ohio River, and as you move north over time, they begin blooming in a wave. And she quantified the velocity of this wave, which I think is kind of interesting. So forsythia bloom spread north at the velocity of 16 kilometers per day. But as you move later into the season, the wave slows down. So for example, Miss Chem lilac migrating north, the wave at only 9 kilometers per day. So finally, I just want to talk a little bit about phenology as the foundational science of human existence. And throughout the large proportion of our history, human existence and food availability very much tied to the seasons: fishing, hunting, agriculture. In fact, it still is. We may not be the ones that are directly engaged in it, but we harvest the fruits of phenological understanding at the grocery store. If you've been to Sechrist Arboretum, and I know many of you have, you might be familiar with the Discovery Pavilion, which interprets phenology as the foundational science of agriculture. Inside there's a number of educational panels focused on different aspects of phenology related to the historical significance of phenology up through climate change and relevance to pest management. The openings, there's 4 openings, and they're aligned with dawn and dusk on the summer solstice and winter solstice. So here is dawn on the summer solstice, dusk in the winter solstice, one of the rare years when it was a sunny day in late December. See the sunset there, 2019. But that architecture was inspired by these Native American earthenworks in southern Ohio, Serpent Mound and Fort Ancient. And these earthenworks have phenological significance, and they're symbolic of this human obsession with phenology. Stonehenge, another great example. But these, it was in the 90s, it was discovered that these earthenworks had celestial significance. So, for example, Serpent Mound, this is the world's largest surviving effigy mound down near Hillsboro in Appalachia. Not sure who built it, either the Adinas or the Fort Ancient cultures. And there's evidence of both, and maybe both contributed to this. But what it's been found is, from this point, these coils point to summer solstice, spring equinox, winter solstice, and the head points directly, and the egg, if that's what it is, directly to summer solstice sunset. So, they are charting the seasons. Fort Ancient, largest prehistoric hilltop enclosure in the United States. This is north of Kings Island, north of Cincinnati, just off I-71, where it crosses the Little Miami River. It sits on the ridge overlooking the Little Miami River here. I-71 would be now current day right over here. This was Ohio's first state park, founded in 1891, built by the Hopewell culture and then subsequently occupied by the Fort Ancient culture. And one of the archaeological or architectural features is known as the Foursquare there. And the Foursquare, these at each corner are these kind of stone domes that were built. And these stone mounds align with openings in the walls to mark celestial events. And for example, they have a winter solstice festival now every year, although it was canceled this past year. But here you can see the sunset through the opening as viewed from this cornerstone, the winter solstice celebration. But these are worth a visit. Serpent Mound down here near Hillsboro, Fort Ancient here just off I-71 near Lebanon, Ohio. They've been nominated as part of, with other earthenworks in Ohio as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So we're waiting to hear about that. And at Fort Ancient, there's a wonderful interactive native Indian museum there. That's really, I think it's really well done. So with that, I'll just leave you with this. There's a few, what I think are really good climate sites with very authoritative information with for the layperson, but links to the peer-reviewed research if you want to underline it, if you want to dive in. And feel free to email me with any questions at dan.herms@davie.com. And then I'm happy to, I guess I went a little bit long. It's 11:02 by my watch, but happy to entertain any questions or comments that people may have now. And, thank you, Denise, for 20 some years of working together on phenology and participating in your programs, and thank all of you for your interest in biodiversity, conservation, pollinators, and our natural world.